الله الرحمن الرحيم. بروفيسور أكرم اللي هو يعني جيبوا له الكوتور. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. أهلا بكم جميعا في مركز دراسة الإسلام والديمقراطية. واليوم نحن سعداء باستضافة الأستاذ أوكسهورن فيليب أوكسهورن من جامعة ماكجيل يونيفرسيتي، وهو بروفوست يعني رئيس قسم في العلوم السياسية في جامعة ماكجيل، ومختص في موضوع علاقة الدين والدولة في مراحل الانتقال الديمقراطي في العديد من الدول. ونحن سعداء جدا أنه جاء في زيارة إلى تونس، فاستضفناه باش يعطينا محاضرة حول المجتمع المدني الديمقراطية ودور الدين، ويعني سيقارن التجربة التونسية بتجارب دول أخرى وخاصة أمريكا اللاتينية. إذن الأستاذ أوكسهورن كما قلنا هو أستاذ في جامعة ماكجيل، وله عديد من الكتابات بعثناها لكم في البيوغرافي نتاعو اللي حاجته به، العديد من المقالات والكتابات. سيتكلم باللغة الإنجليزية، ولكن ثم ترجمة فورية موجودة بالنسبة للي يحتاج باش الترجمة ياخذ جهاز من الخلف. إذن أقدم لكم ونرحب جميعا بالأستاذ فيليب أوكسهورن من جامعة ماكجيل يونيفرسيتي، فليتفضل.
Merhaba, merci, bienvenue. It's really a privilege for me to be here with you. Thank you all for coming. So my work originally began studying transitions to democracy in Latin America. And in talking to people and trying to learn more about the revolution in Tunisia, I'm struck by the similarities and differences. And oftentimes, the value of comparison is that one learns to appreciate what is important and why, and learn from the experience of other peoples in order to deal with problems that are often more similar than we realize. So when I went to Chile in the mid-1980s, a long time ago, it was one of the first transitions in Latin America, one of the first revolutions. And one of the things that I didn't even appreciate as much at the time until talking to people and learning more about Tunisia, and learning that in Tunisia, instead of a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, there's a Truth and Dignity Commission. I realized that back in the mid-80s, before there were any Truth and Reconciliation Commissions, before Argentina had done the first one, must be careful, before Argentina had its one, what the Chileans talked to, people living in poor areas, the marginalized, they wanted dignity. And I think that says it all, because whatever dignity means, it usually includes respect, a willingness to listen, a willingness to understand or try to understand the position of other people. And that in many ways affects how I view things like the revolution in Tunisia, transitions to democracy elsewhere, and that is how I'm going to organize my comments today. So the first thing I wanted to do is talk a little bit in more theoretical terms so you have a sense of where I'm coming from conceptually. And for me, the starting point is civil society. And obviously that's very important in Tunisia, and as I'll say in a few minutes, in many ways, that's what not only sets Tunisia apart from other countries in the Arab Spring, but in many fundamental ways separates it from other earlier transitions elsewhere, such as South Africa's, or those in Latin America, or the former Soviet bloc. And so the first thing that is important for me is, how do we define civil societies? The literature in political science and sociology talks about civil society all the time. It's become popularized, we see it in the media. We don't always understand the same thing when we say civil society. So for me, and I think this is very applicable to Tunisia, what is civil society? It's organizations created by the people themselves. In other words, different sectors of society, trade unions, women's groups, other groups, they create their own organizations with the idea of saying, these are our interests, that this is what we think is important, this is what we think is the priorities for us. And if you think about that, without those organizations, these self-constituted organizations, it's impossible to have democracy. Because if you don't know what your interests are and your priorities are, how do you negotiate, how do you enter into political transactions with anybody? And that's the magic of civil society, but also the biggest challenge. Because it's very hard for people to organize themselves and to be able to define their own interests from their perspective, to set their own priorities, and then enter into various forms of engagement with other civil society actors, the state, and political parties. And so this idea of organizations is central. And so when the quartet won the Nobel Prize, I thought, this is fantastic for me, because this is what I've always thought should happen in any case. And Tunisia stands out because of the strength of its civil society and the ability of civil society in that sense to participate actively in the politics of the revolution. Now, the second thing I want to say is that if you look at civil society as I do in terms of organizations that are autonomous, that define their own interests, and really defend them in interactions with other people, then what civil society becomes is a mechanism for non-violent conflict resolution. In other words, it's silly to pretend that there aren't conflicts in societies. The more complex the societies are, the older the societies are, the more likely there are to be conflicts, because as human beings we rarely agree on anything. Even when we look at religious groupings and other groupings that we take for granted, they're never homogeneous. Religious groups, women's groups, ethnic groups are divided on a variety of levels, and it's their ability to organize and express their interests to understand those divisions that's essential for democracy and allows civil society to mediate conflict in a positive, constructive way. What this also means, too, is that violence and civil society are incompatible. Whatever civil society represents, it's nonviolent forms of political participation. Now, this is important because societies can be very, very strong. So societies that created the Iranian Revolution, the Cuban Revolution, the Russian and Chinese revolutions, they're very, very strong. They're not civil society as I define it here. They don't allow that space in society for people to organize, to define and defend their interests and interact with others. And on top of that, there's various forms of violence. And the same with dictatorships, non-democratic governments more traditionally defined. And one of the challenges of civil society, and this is in a nutshell what the revolution represents in Tunisia, I think, is challenging that, to allow to win the space to organize publicly and engage in this way in political practices. Similarly, what civil society as a whole does is it allows for the inclusion of different groups. So strong civil societies are civil societies where the least powerful, the most disadvantaged, are also able to organize themselves to participate. And weak civil societies are defined by the absence of that. Another important thing about civil society for me is that it really defines what citizenship is all about, what the rights and expectations of people who live in a country are. And that too is a process of negotiation. And when it comes down to it, what civil society really is about is who participates and how. And strong civil societies mean that more and more people are able to participate in the definition not only of their own interests, but in that of society as a whole. And in many ways, that's what democracy strives to achieve. Now, again, with that idea, just one other aspect of it that I think is very important to emphasize, and it's what I call a minimal societal consensus. A minimal societal consensus. In other words, for civil society to emerge, become strong, to resolve conflicts nonviolently, people have to agree on two things. The first is that they're part of a larger whole. In other words, they have to come to the agreement that whether they like it or not, they're Tunisian, they're Chilean, they're South African, because then and only then can civil society then refer to what we call a public good. It doesn't mean that groups necessarily like being part of that society. It may be that they have no choice, that it's the second best alternative, but it's only when that first idea of consensus, that we're all in it together, whether we like it or not, that you can begin to see civil society emerge and work towards nonviolent conflict resolution, defining citizenship, and really defining what the public good is all about. In other words, there's an agreement that there's a larger public, and people organizationally begin to actively try to define what that is. The second part of that consensus is that there is respect for the rights of other groups to do the same. In other words, we're all in it together. We're all Tunisians, Chileans, Canadians, and we have to give the same respect to other Canadians, Tunisians, Chileans that we would expect from them. This is another reason why violence is antithetical to civil society. So it's minimum. It doesn't mean we agree on everything. And in fact, the more we disagree, the more important civil society is. Some of the literature, often called social capital from the United States, refers to trust as being essential for civil society. And to be frank, my opinion is no. If we all trusted each other, civil society would be easier. But it's when we don't have high levels of trust that civil society is more important. Why? Because when we don't trust other people, in a basic sense, as long as we respect them, then it's important to organize to make sure that our interests are heard, that our priorities are taken into account, that we're part of that negotiating process. And so what often happens is that through transitions, revolutions, trust begins to emerge as a result of the success of civil society. But it's not a prerequisite for civil society. And I emphasize that for one important reason. In any society coming out of a revolution like Tunisia's, where you've had many problems of violence and the abuse of human rights, it's very difficult to trust. One of the ways that people react to non-democratic regimes is they put their guard up. They don't trust people because they're not sure if they're trustworthy. And that's okay. It's not ideal. And civil society is a way of rebuilding or building in the first instance trust when it doesn't exist. So I think this is, for me at least, is simple and straightforward. Civil society becomes the cornerstone of successful democracies because it helps avoid violence, it helps mediate difference, it allows people to have a direct role in defining what it means to be part of a country. Now, the second idea here is the role, when we're talking about Tunisia, but also more generally, is the role of religion. For many people, religion per se and civil society are antithetical. You can't talk about the two. They're very, very different. And to be quite honest, I think that's absolutely wrong and counterproductive. Why? Well, the reason is simple. For all of us, I mean, there were theories in the 50s and 60s that said the whole world would become secular. We would forget about religion. We would be more concerned with consumption and lifestyles, and values and religious beliefs would mean nothing. And more in Europe, Western Europe, than the rest of the world, that is kind of true. But everywhere else, it's not true. And it's not unique to the Middle East. In Latin America, not only are most people Catholic, but increasingly Christians, part of the Catholic tradition, but very, very different, are some of the most active political groups. And so for me to say that church and society are separate, that the church, whatever the church might be, is never part of civil society, is wrong. And like looking at civil society as trust and a lack of difference and conflict is counterproductive. Now, in saying that, that doesn't necessarily mean that all religions and all groups are part of, religious groups are part of civil society. For me, again, it's that same minimum consensus. If religious groups are willing to accept that they're part of a larger whole, to respect the rights of other religions or people sharing the same religion who might disagree amongst themselves, or non-believers, that's the key, that same minimum consensus. In terms of religion, it's tolerance for other beliefs. And the reality is, in my humble experience, that most religions conform to that. Not all of them, but most. And it's really not an issue of which religions do or which religions don't, but it's really a question of extremism. So for example, we all know what the Ku Klux Klan is in the United States, a very racist, white supremacist organization, has nothing to do with civil society. But what we often don't realize, particularly the farther away one is from the United States, is that the Ku Klux Klan is very much linked to Catholicism and Christianity. So the abuses most famous for the Ku Klux Klan are burning crosses on the lawn, hanging people or putting them on crosses. The religious symbolism is clear and it's deliberate. We would never define Catholicism or Christianity by the behavior of the Ku Klux Klan. In fact, we use the values of Christianity and Catholicism to help condemn Ku Klux Klan activities in Catholic Christian societies. Same is true with other religions, and obviously the same is true for Islam. So extremism, whether it's Ku Klux Klan or ISIL, that's not part of civil society. For them, civil society is the enemy as well. But we don't define religions by their extremes. We define religions so that we can then understand and marginalize them. And the reality, at least in my opinion, is that stronger civil society is, in general, the more organizations there are that are self-constructed, where groups define and defend their own interests, the more difficult it is for extremism to take hold. Because what civil society does is it marginalizes and excludes those actors, whatever their base, ideological, religion, or what have you, they're excluded from the process because they don't buy into that minimum consensus. Very briefly, opposition parties play a crucial role, we all know that, and the nature of that role and the constructiveness of that role depends on the representation that parties have of different groups within civil society, with their connections to civil society, and their respect for responsive, accountable government. In other words, whether we realize it or not, we apply the same criteria that I would apply to civil society in evaluating the function and the success or failure of political parties from a democratic perspective. And finally, the last thing, and then I'll talk about the two regions, is government, and particularly the role of the military. Governments can either work with or work against civil society. By definition, non-democratic governments of any nature work against civil society. So the old communist governments of the past or Cuba today, they don't like civil society because civil society challenges them. Similarly, other forms of democracy, whether it's a theocracy like Iran, or just a plain dictatorship like pre-revolutionary Tunisia, they're opposed to civil society because the values, this idea of a minimum consensus, challenges the legitimacy of their rule and forces them, or works to force them, to open up, to be accountable. In other words, take consequences for their actions, and more fundamentally, to be responsive. And the last thing about the government, and then I'll talk about the cases, is the role of the military. The reality is that the military, for better or for worse, is always key in modern societies. Why? One of the defining characteristics of modern societies is that they have relatively strong militaries. And where militaries choose to repress, the outcome can be polarization, high levels of violence, other kinds of revolutions compared to the Tunisian revolution, non-democratic revolutions, and where militaries do not repress or choose not to repress or collapse in the midst of a political crisis, then it opens up the space for a Tunisian-like revolution, for transitions to democracy in South Africa, or Eastern Europe, or Latin America. So those thematic ideas, what are some lessons from Latin America, and how do they shed light, or how do they help us understand, or might they help us understand the experience of Tunisia, the Arab Spring in general? The first lesson to extract from this is that transitions to democracy, in the sense that there's a demand for elections, and those elections are held more or less democratically, needs to come from civil society. If people within society don't want it, it's not going to happen. When they demand it through organizations of civil society, not only is it more likely to come about, but it's more likely to succeed. Now, part of what this also implies is very important. Democracy may have originated in the West, but I firmly believe it's a universal concept in the sense that all peoples of all religions and cultures could strive to have governments that are responsive and accountable based on active citizen participation. That's all democracy is. It usually includes elections, but it's much more than elections. And I think that when society decides that this is what it wants, it's a changing point. And as the example from countries as diverse as Afghanistan or Turkey, in some ways Tunisia, show us, it's not a hard thing to learn. That we can all learn to be Democrats rather quickly once we're exposed to the ideas and given the opportunity. What's more difficult is designing the institutions to make sure that votes count, that they're counted correctly, that only legitimate votes are counted. That takes time. But as we see in the backlashes against undemocratic elections all over the world, the first people to realize and complain are the average citizen. It's not easy to appreciate the value of that. It's not easy to convince people that non-democratic processes, once they realize their benefit, are taking place. And so what we see from Latin America is that when civil society begins to mobilize, that's when you begin to see the first openings towards change, what we would call a revolution here in Tunisia. The second point from Latin America is that it can be quick, as in the case of Argentina, or it can take a long, long time, as was the case in Chile. So for example, the first public protest in favor of democracy in Chile started in 1983, and the first democratic elections were held in 1990. So 7 years. And this is a country that had a long history of democracy prior to a coup d'etat that overthrew the elected government and allowed the military to assume power. At the other extreme was Argentina. And what happened there, among other things, is that a completely failed economic policy that led to hyperinflation and tremendous social dislocations under a military rule was compounded when the military decided, for nationalist reasons, to invade the Falklands Malvinas Islands, attacking Britain, thinking that Britain wouldn't care, and that they would be able to rally support around the flag and stay in power. And much to the chagrin of the Argentine military, the Prime Minister at the time, Margaret Thatcher, said, no, we're not going to let the Argentines get away with it. And in fact, she rallied support around her to implement her own economic reforms. So the military failed economically, and and they failed politically, or because in the sense that they went to war, that they didn't need to go to war, and then they lost the war. So as soon as it was clear that they'd lost the war, the transition took place as quickly as it possibly could. So the military had no choice but to step back from power. In the middle was Brazil, where the transition took even longer than Chile's, because the military government played an intermediate role, negotiating partially with civil society so that it could control the transition and end up with a democratic regime that was very conservative and restrictive. So the length of time is less important than what happens during however long a period there is. One of the benefits of having the collapse of the military in Argentina is that it was the first in Latin America, one of the very few countries that was able to actually put former heads of state, former military generals, in prison for the abuses of human rights that they committed. That's because the military had lost any legitimacy and ability to enter into politics. The second important lesson from Latin America is that the Catholic Church played a vital role. In fact, in countries like Chile and Brazil, it played a role that was almost essential in the following sense. The Catholic Church, because most Latin Americans are Catholic, did two things. The first thing that it did is it championed a demand for democracy. Now, if you think about that, it's quite amazing because whatever the Catholic Church is, it's not democratic. It's patriarchal, highly centralized, very, very old, very, very conservative. And yet the moderate Catholic Church and the more radical variants of it all agreed that the solution for Latin America was democracy. So they became champions of that. The second thing that they did is they facilitated the growth of civil society outside of the church. And so they supported women's groups even though they had no desire to support the interests that those women groups pursued. They were willing to support them because they realized the importance of their role in society. They even sheltered and sponsored communists, atheists, because they realized the value of supporting those groups to enshrine this minimum consensus and allow civil society to get on with it. And in addition to sheltering people and nurturing groups, they gave them training, because you have to learn how to organize. They helped them in the sense of their ability to determine with some legitimacy what the groups they represented wanted, what their priorities were. And they gave them a place to meet, where it was very difficult to find space. Now, opposition political parties, the pro-democracy parties in Latin America, this varied a lot. Some of them, like in Chile, had real roots in civil society. And even though most of them were complicit with the coup d'etat, thinking that when the military came to power, they would then give power back to those parties, they learned their lesson. And so they played a very important role as well in listening to civil society, in representing civil society, and pushing the goal towards democracy much better. In countries like Brazil, one of the reasons why the transition took even longer than Chile's wasn't because of military obstinance the way it was in Chile. It was because the parties were very weak. They were in it for themselves. They were seen as self-interested and not really representing civil society. And if you follow Brazilian politics now, one of the consequences of that, and we're talking, the transition ended in 1989 with the first elections. It's now over 25 years later. And the source of the worst economic crisis and political crisis in the country's history is that same lack of representativeness and strength of most political parties. Because they're not connected with civil society the way one might want, or in the case of the Workers' Party, the way they used to be. And then Argentina is again a unique case because they have one very strong party, a populist nationalist political party, and the rest is anarchy. The last thing about Latin America is that in all cases, for different reasons, the military refrained from high levels of repression to quash civil society. Chile was actually the one regime where the repression was most systematic. but ultimately civil society prevailed because the military realized that it needed to protect its own image within civil society. So it stepped back. In Argentina, they had no choice. And in Brazil, it was in an intermediate role. So when we look at transitions, and when I say transition, I mean to the first election, and we compare that general experience with Tunisia and its revolution, what stands out? Well, the quartet, the Nobel laureate group, represented civil society in a way that I think epitomizes what civil society ideally should do. So in some senses, I think everybody would agree civil society in Tunisia is stronger than it probably is in the rest of the Middle East. But it's actually quite strong in terms of what we find in other countries at similar levels of political and economic development. And the quartet's role in constraining extremes, allowing and promoting consensus, mediating conflict in a nonviolent way, is really one of the reasons why it won, rightfully so, I think, the Nobel Peace Prize. So what that highlights is, again, the importance that civil society can play in maintaining not only democracy, but preventing extremism from ripping societies apart. And if we look at Egypt, you can see a very dramatic difference there. Civil society, unlike Tunisia's, was much more lopsided, much more imbalanced, with a domination in many ways by the Islamic Brotherhood, which is always kind of a social movement, a political party. It's a hybrid, and very little else to counterbalance that. During the protests, students were very active. Other non-religious sectors of society were very active. They didn't really have, in the end, that self-constituted organization that would allow them to say, this is what's important to us and why, and enter into negotiations. I mean, that simplifies it a little bit, but it's part of the problem that allowed for the polarization and the ability of the Islamic Brotherhood to become so powerful. There are very few counterbalancing forces. And you all know much better than I do, but I don't think my understanding is completely wrong. Remember, the Brotherhood started out as a reformist religious movement way back in the early part of the 20th century. But taking power transformed it. The nature of the revolution probably helped transform it. But even more importantly, the incapacity of civil society to restrain it meant that the Arab Spring came to a crashing halt. It meant that many of the same normally civil society groups, students, liberals, that had supported the Arab Spring in the beginning, now supported a coup d'etat because that was seen as a better alternative to what they had, which is a tragedy. We can understand why they would make that choice, but it's still a tragedy, and I think it ultimately reflects the weakness of civil society and its incapacity to rein in extremism, as well as political naivete and a bit of political opportunism. But just to step back, one of the problems when we look at religion or cultural groups or other groups that are defined by identity is we forget that they can use things like their religion or their cultural or ethnic identity to mask other interests like power, wealth, etc. And so in other words, they're not civil society, they're human. And their religion, whatever that might be, their ethnicity, whatever that might be, is less important than the idea that they want power. The old saying in English, power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. It has some meaning for us when we look at Egypt at least. Now, after the elections, the real work really begins. And one of the reasons for that is that many of the key decisions that need to be taken as a society as a whole are postponed until after the elections are held. So in Latin America, if there were constitutional changes like in Tunisia after its first elections, they take place after the elections. In many cases, the issues that had divided the society way back when the authoritarian regimes came to power in the first place, they're at best latent, and at worst they're coming up again from the bottom up. And how to deal with that, the decisions necessary to address them, the appropriate policies, many of those key fundamental decisions that would, in essence, define the quality of the new democratic regime were postponed. So what happened? What happened throughout Latin America is that very quickly, people who had struggled for democracy, people who had won, because they now had democratic elected governments, were unhappy with what the result was. They felt, with good reasons, that all that effort didn't really lead to much change. In Latin America, the economic policies at the time created what was called a lost half-century. We often talk about the 1980s as the lost decade. In Latin America, in the 90s, there was a lost period of about 5 or 6 years when there was high economic growth rates, but no jobs. So high economic growth rates, often higher than the historic averages, combined with higher than historical averages for unemployment and growing levels of poverty and inequality. Oftentimes, particularly at the local level, the people that citizens interacted with were the same as they were before the revolution, before the transition. So there was a lot of frustration very quickly. Now, two things are different about Latin America than perhaps is the case in Tunisia and the Middle East more generally. The first, and this is very important, I think, is that by the time all of the countries had elected governments, the radical alternative, the extremist alternative, had been eliminated or reduced to insignificance. One of the reasons for that was that the Cold War was now over, and so leftist violence was now marginalized. One of the reasons not only was the end of the Cold War, it was the fact that so many former leftist guerrillas had suffered the consequences of authoritarian rule that they began to appreciate the value of civil society and democracy. So there was really no far extreme alternative with any societal credibility at that time. That makes things easier than it would be in the Middle East, where Islamic fundamentalism is obviously real and present. The other difference with Latin America is that, is that there was a very high level of respect for the importance of institutions. So no matter how frustrated people were, no matter how severe economic crises would be, including hyperinflation in Brazil and in Argentina, where the prices in the afternoon in the store are higher than they are in the morning when the store opens up, it never brought the military back in. There have been no more coups d'etats since the 1970s, and that's good. What it means is that, however effectively or ineffectively, Latin America has learned the importance of dealing with crises through institutions, through constitutions. It's very controversial what's happening in Brazil, but the truth is that for the first time, Brazil is its worst economic and its worst political crisis in its history, and they're coinciding, yet the Constitution has been basically respected. There may be problems, and those problems probably reflect weaknesses of the Constitution as much as anything else. The rule of law and a rejection of impunity are the hallmarks of what's happening. And that's good, and it favors long-term democracy. Now, if we look at Tunisia, in many ways, it's not that different. A lot of frustration, particularly among unemployed young people, particularly educated young people who feel that their talents and their investments in their own education aren't paying off. That things may not only have not changed, but even have gotten worse for reasons that are beyond anybody's control. And so, in many ways, Tunisia's revolution epitomized the potential of civil society, and its ongoing prognosis depends on the ability of civil society to continue playing that fundamental role of marginalizing extremes, of helping to build a sense of the public good based on that minimum consensus, and working with political parties so that political parties come to represent civil society rather than dominate it or attempt to control it. So you all know better the prospects for what will come next in Tunisia. But I think from a comparative perspective, it's easy to forget how things have been relatively quite good in Tunisia. Obviously, there's been political instability, there have been problems. That's the norm in most revolutionary settings of this kind. And so far, so good. The institutions have not only been respected, arguably they're stronger. Civil society certainly was strong before, and I think it's a richness and a resource that continues to help Tunisia remain apart from many other countries in a very volatile region where instability is the level of instability is much higher than it ever was in Latin America or Africa or even Eastern Europe when it experiences those transitions. So I think that I've probably said enough, and I would love to have a discussion with you. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Oxford. It was a very rich lecture, and I'm sure there are lots of questions and comments about your lecture. But let me begin with one. I think in Egypt there was a strong civil society, secular civil society, in addition to the civil society that was close to the Muslim Brotherhood. But the problem is they did not talk to each other. And we see that a lot in the Arab world, even in Tunisia to some extent, a polarization. Almost like we're having two separate civil societies. One that believes that religion has a role to play in public life, and another that thinks religion should stay out of public life. And it's a very touchy and difficult subject. So from your experience or the experience of other countries, how do you bridge that gap? How do you bring the two, let's say, the two parts of civil society together and build a compromise about the role of religion in politics that can unite them rather than divide them?
That's a very important question and a very difficult question. So, when I said that Egypt had a weaker civil society, I was referring to the whole. And so that division, the idea that there are two civil societies, for me it's the weakness of civil society as a whole. That's right, because you have organizations going against each other rather than together. It's not a matter of assessing blame, although people have opinions on that, obviously. My sense is that there's plenty of blame to go around. And for a variety of reasons, this idea of a minimal societal consensus didn't exist. And we know from Indonesia, we know from Turkey, we know from Tunisia, that it's not religion necessarily. And unless I'm completely wrong, the Islamic Brotherhood represented a different form of Islam when it was formed. In fact, part of the problem for me is just twofold. How it reacted to the repression of the military regime under Mubarak, which radicalized it. And obviously, in this region, radicalization is more conceivable than it would have been in Latin America. So that's one of the problems. And the other problem, I think, is that polarization also represented important biases and prejudices. And it's under the circumstances, which I really don't know and didn't experience, I wouldn't want to blame anybody. We have to ask ourselves why that conversation is even taking place. And I think it's very important, at least from my point of view, to emphasize it could have, even though the Brotherhood is a religious organization. And why it didn't, and blame on both sides. I think that, and this is a classic problem in Turkey, right? The secularists, they had a false view of what secularization meant too. And so that what happens in Egypt is an extreme consequence of that same ideology. And work by people like Alfred Stephan and others, a long tradition, emphasize that there are different ways to have secular states. France is one extreme, but it's the extreme, and it's actually quite different in every other country in the world. There's very few countries that have that as an extreme of separation of church and state. what's important is that all religions are treated equally, and that all religions treat other religions with equal respect. And it's not something that is particular to any particular religion. As I said, the Ku Klux Klan has its own religious origins as well. It's how the religion is interpreted and practiced by its leaders.
أنا أشكر المحاضرة هذه مهمة جدا. أنا كان بدي أن تكون عنوان المحاضرة أو الوجه الدق not civil society democracy and the role of religion, but the role of the institution of religion. We speak about church and not about religion. أرى أن هناك مجموعة من الأسئلة والمقارنات بين السياق التونسي والسياق الأمريكي اللاتيني، وهي الملاحظة الأولى وكأن الدكتور المحاضر ينطلق من خطاطة هناك الدولة وهناك الأحزاب وهناك المجتمع المدني. الأحزاب غارقة في حسابها حول التموقعات والمصالح، والمجتمع المدني مسكون بشيء اسمه المصلحة العامة. وقع الأمر دائما وفي السياق التونسي بالتحديد المجتمع المدني منخرط حتى العمق في السياسة وفي الإيديولوجيا وفي الأحزاب. بالتالي الرهانات المجتمع المدني هي أيضا بشكل ما رهانات سياسية. يمكن في غير مركز دراسة الإسلام والديمقراطية أن نقول لغة مجاملة ولغة أحيانا خشبية، لكن حينما نتحدث عن الحقيقة المجتمع المدني التونسي ما زال لم يتطهر من سياقات العمل في وضع الاستبداد. كثير من مظاهر المجتمع المدني هي أحزاب سياسية متنكرة. بل أكثر من هذا، الدولة التونسية ما زالت لحد الآن لم تخلص لمواطنيها. وزارات نتيجة لصفقات تمت تاريخية ما بين الدولة التونسية، مش الدولة نتاع التجمع الدستوري الديمقراطي، لا، هذه صورة مبسطة. ثم أطراف إيديولوجية دخلت للسلطة ودخلت بالتحديد لبعض الوزارات ومصالحها اللي حتى الآن لا تفرط فيها. وبالتالي وقت اللي نجي نشوف الدعم الثقافي ولا غيره أجد مشفق، لا أجد شفافية بل أجد الورقات. إذا هذه صعوبة من الصعوبات الأساسية. هذه ملاحظة له. الملاحظة الثانية، وأيضا أنا بدي في مركز الإسلام والديمقراطية نتحدث ما نتخنقوش، نقول الحقيقة. المعادلات الانتقال الديمقراطي ليست معادلات داخلية. ما حصل في أمريكا اللاتينية، ما حصل في المكسيك بالتحديد، كان هناك دور رئيسي للولايات المتحدة الأمريكية في إنجاحه. حتى بقية الدول، البرازيل، تشيلي، غيرها من الدول. أوروبا الوسطى، أوروبا الشرقية أيضا وجدت حاضنة. التحولات التي تمت في منطقتنا لم تجد هذه الحاضنة، بل بالعكس وجد محاولات ترويج ومحاولات تحكم. أرى من التبسيط تماما أن نقارن بين الحالتين التونسية والمصرية تماما. بمعنى يجب أن نتواضع كتونسيين. نحن بعاد على سرة العالم، بعاد على فلسطين، وبعاد على البحر الأحمر، وليس لنا 7 ملايين ونص قبطي. بالتالي الموضوع لا يتعلق بأنه الأخوان تحاوروا مع المجتمع المدني ولا ما تحاوروش، بل هي حجم الرهانات الدولية المتوجهة في مصر وحجم الرهانات على بلد ملقى في الضفاف بتاع المتوسط 164,000 كيلومتر مربع دون بترول. بالتالي الموضوع يتعلق، نوسع النظر لكي نستطيع أن نفهم حجم التحولات التي يمكن أن تحصل في المنطقة. فيما يتعلق بموضوع الدين كان بودي أن كنت أتصور أن نتحدث على لو التحرر، أن نتحدث عن المراجعات الفكرية التجديدية وليس فقط عن المؤسسة الدينية، لأنه في تونس في منطقتنا ما عندناش مؤسسة دينية، أو هم مش تتعلق في تونس ما نشي إلا عن نشي، ممكن مؤسسة دينية موجودة شوية في مصر، حتى في المغرب ضعيفة قروية، في تونس ما عندناش. إذا اللي موجود هنا كالدين مش المؤسسة الدينية اللي توجد في أمريكا اللاتينية، ربما هي أكثرية المؤسسة الدينية. مجموعة من الملاحظات فقط، هو تفاعلا وإثراء المداخلة بتاع الأستاذ، وإن شاء الله تكون ثم مداخلات من أخرى. شكرا.
The PowerPoint too about civil society and the stakes and playing its role. I think, I mean, you certainly know the country much better than I do, but what you're saying actually makes sense. And what I think is important to emphasize is how you explained it. Because you explained it you didn't say, or maybe I misunderstood, that it's because it's this kind of group or this kind of group that they're opportunistic. You said they're opportunistic. And that's very important because it means that some religious groups are more, some are less opportunistic. Some political parties are more, some are less opportunistic. It's a general problem that we don't want to stereotype. You use it as a stereotype. It doesn't have to be that way. It could be better and it can be worse. However bad it is, the point is it's a problem of governance. It's not a problem of religion, of culture. It's something more fundamental. And maybe, unfortunately, more related to human nature, greed, power. Now, the U.S. role, of course, is very, very important. But the first thing to say is that the military regimes in Latin America were all supported by the U.S. 30, 40 years ago. So having U.S. support, like with Egypt, it can work both ways. There's no guarantee that the U.S. will side with democracy. So in some ways, Tunisia is lucky because there's no oil, the strategic importance of the country isn't perceived. And so the U.S. is backing off. And my Latin American friends would say we wish the U.S. would back off sometimes. Although they played a very, very critical role in the initial transitions, and you're absolutely right. When the U.S. wants to play a big role, a positive role, it can, but we can't assume that it will always play a positive role. This is an anecdote. You know, the coup d'etat that brought the military to government in Chile was actually actively supported by the military. And when I was there in the mid-'80s and the transition was beginning to start, my communist friend, he actually publicly praised the U.S. ambassador, as did other communists, because the U.S. had changed its policy, and instead of supporting the counter-revolution, a very brutal military regime, and now actively stood up to Pinochet, the dictator. So that was a good change. And obviously it's better to have the U.S. with you than against you.
Where was this?
Chile. And so it's ingrained in popular culture that the U.S. was the bad guy in bringing on the military regime. So things can change, and the U.S.'s role is always underestimated. And I think that if I had the good fortune to be able to talk to President Obama, what I would tell him is that one has to look at the Middle East not in terms of religion, but one needs to look at it in terms of the potential for democracy. That's what we're talking about today. It's not Islam or Christianity. It's how it's interpreted, how it's used, and by whom. And that's the level of sophistication that unfortunately is often lacking in U.S. policy. It's a blanket white or black situation, and there's not the subtlety and the willingness to see those important gray areas and make key distinctions because they're hard to explain. So I hope I responded to your points. Very much appreciate them.
Thank you for your conference. My name is Ali Ben Makrouk. I'm a journalist. I have one simple question. can we consider trade unions as part of civil society?
Consider what?
Trade unions.
Oh, yeah.
Let me tell you why I'm asking this
Yeah.
question.
Yeah.
Nowadays, trade unions are asking for increase of salaries,
Yeah.
while the government is about to collapse.
Yeah.
We don't know if at the end of this month the government will be able to provide salaries.
Yeah.
So how can we tell that trade unions are part of civil society?
Did you want to add to that? Okay. No, that's a very important question. And my answer, and I'm serious, is it depends. Sometimes it is and sometimes it isn't. And what determines whether it is or whether it isn't? And there's unfortunately a lot of experience in Latin American trade unionism that represents the problem rather than the solution. When trade unionism represents the working class, which is what it was supposed to do, when it's an autonomous organization that defines the interests of the working class, then it's a key actor in civil society. So we look at the social democracies in Western Europe, even the more limited social democracy of the US, the greater social democracy in Canada compared to the US, the workers' movement played a vital role in insisting on that. And it's because of it's because it was authentic, it was by workers for workers in general, that it was part of civil society, and the outcome was the welfare state. Without the working class, then it wouldn't have happened, or wouldn't have happened in the same way. In Latin America, sometimes you get that. In Chile, you got that under its democratic period. But what often happens, and this is beginning to happen outside of Latin America, is that the trade unions don't represent workers, they represent themselves. So there are many examples in Latin America where trade union leaders would sign agreements with the government that meant lower wages, meant worse working conditions, meant fewer protections for workers, in exchange for protections of the prerogatives of the leaders that negotiated on behalf of workers. So there was a disconnect between the leaders and the rank and file. And that's not civil society, and it makes the problems worse. So I'm not going to pretend to know about trade unionism here in Tunisia, but the criteria I would use is whether or not the policies that are being advocated favor a small segment, the leadership of the working class, are genuinely intended to improve the quality of life for all workers. When it's the latter, when it's truly committed to raising standards of living and the quality of life for everybody, that's a key and vital actor in civil society. And in the West, that's really where it was born. But when they don't, when they're self-interested, when they're concerned about their own privileges, then it's not only not civil society, but it's an obstacle to civil society. So that's a very important point. Thank you for raising it.
Thank you very much, Professor Oxhorn. لدي تعليق وسؤال. My name is اسمي أمال عزوز. أنا كنت نائبة في المجلس الوطني التأسيسي، وكنت أيضا عضو في حكومة السيد حبيب السيد، والآن أنا أدرس الأدب الإنجليزي فقط. وأنا أيضا في مجلس شورى حركة النهضة. إذا قلت لدي تعليق. الأول هو دور، والمحاضرة كما أرى هي civil society، دور المجتمع المدني في مراحل الانتقال. ما يهمني في هذه المسألة هي ما أراه خاصة في بلدان الربيع العربي من دور المجتمع المدني، وأساسا في تونس. أنا تقديري يعني حضرتك تكلمت على مصر وعلى تونس في وضع الانتقال، وخاصة في وضع الاستقطاب الإيديولوجي والسياسي الحاد والفكري الحاد، وهذا مسألة أشار إليها المتدخل الأول. هناك خلط حقيقي في مجتمعاتنا ما بين المجتمع المدني والمجتمع السياسي. مثلا أعطيك مثلا ما نراه من دور اليوم للمجتمع المدني في تونس لا يقارن بما قام به المجتمع المدني مثلا في الفترة الدقيقة في 2013 خاصة 2013 و2012 وخاصة 2013. يعني الدور الضاغط أمام البرلمان وفي الشارع وفي الإعلام قد خفت تماما الآن، وهذا يفسر بشيء، يفسر إلى أي مدى المجتمع المدني في يعني confusion حقيقية، في خلط حقيقي بين المدني والسياسي، في خاصة هل هو يعني تريد سمة للمجتمعات التي تمر بالانتقال، أم هو سمة يعني ربما تتقاسمها هذه المجتمعات مع غيرها. ملاحظة أخرى أيضا، الدور الذي يقوم به الخارج في المجتمع المدني. أنا تقديري ولقراءة العديد أيضا كون بعد الانتخابات التي حدثت أو التي جرت في بلدان الربيع العربي وأنتجت ما أنتجت من قوى معينة ربما محسوب على الإسلام السياسي، فتقديري أن بعد هذه الانتخابات كان هناك تدخل للخارج، وهذه مسألة ربما لم تشر إليها في بعض البلدان، مثلا بلدان لاتين أمريكا، هناك تدخل حقيقي في ضخ الأموال وتقوية empowering، يعني to empower المجتمع المدني كي يقوم فعلا sort of counterbalancing المجتمع السياسي. فأريد منك تعليق لو سمحت في هذا الدور المجتمع العالمي أو الخارجي في التدخل في الدور أو توجيه الدور يقوم به. سؤالي الآن حول إدارة الأزمات أو دور المجتمع المدني في إدارة الأزمات، ونرجع بالتالي مرة أخرى إلى تونس. سيادتك ذكرت النوبل برايز، وما أدراك ما النوبل برايز، وقد قيل به الكثير، وقد معناها حظي به الكوارتت يعني الرباعي في تونس. كيف ترى مثلا اليوم هذا الرباعي ساهم في حل الأزمة السياسية، ولكن اليوم هناك أزمة اقتصادية حقيقية، وأحد هذه الأقطاب المجتمع المدني وهي الاتحاد يعني الذي قام بالدور الرئيسي في هذه الكونفليكت مانجمنت إذا أردنا. لماذا نراه اليوم مثلا غائب تماما عن، أو هذا المجتمع المدني شبه غائب عن إدارة أزمة اقتصادية حارقة؟ أرى أن المجتمع السياسي والدولة والمجتمع المدني كلهم مفروض ينخرطوا في حل الأزمة. اليوم المجتمع المدني شبه غائب، كيف تقرؤون هذا؟
Well, very good points and question. To be honest, I'm learning so much about Tunisia from the comments that people like yourself are making. I think that the distinction between political and civil society is important, but there's a relationship too, and that is that when we talk about political society in negative terms, it's because they lose that connection with civil society. They're in it for themselves. They don't represent anybody. They're not organizations intended to represent the people or groups of people, but they're in it for themselves. And so that's a real problem. And I think that it's very difficult for somebody like myself to understand why or how the Quartet may have changed its role. But I can tell you that if it has, and it sounds like it has, that's really sad, because that was one of the aspects of the Arab Spring and the revolution that has the most importance in many ways, because it's what keeps the political society, the political class on their toes. Because if civil society doesn't demand a responsive government and accountability for the actions that are taken, who's going to do that? And then when civil society becomes corrupted by those same tendencies, it's even worse. So it's as much a vacuum as a whole new set of problems in and of itself. Where are the trade unions? Where are the unions now? I don't know. But I think what's important is and this is something that maybe it's because I'm a university professor I say this, it's important to understand in an appropriate way the nature of the problem, because if we misunderstand the problem, then we're never going to find the right solutions. In fact, the solutions that we propose may actually make things worse. And I think that what often happens is two things in transitions like Tunisia's. The first is that there's a perception that civil society is sold out. Why? Because parties that have never had the ability to govern because they weren't allowed to need help. And so what they do is they take the best and the brightest civil society leaders in many cases and give them government jobs, which are well paid, which have high job security and other advantages that everybody else wishes. And that's almost inevitable. And I don't know how much that has or hasn't happened in Tunisia, but it happens often, and it creates a misperception because what are they going to do when they're given these nice job offers? And if they say no, the situation will be worse. So it's a perceptual problem that's inevitable because some people have skills that other people simply don't have. Sometimes it's biased in other ways too, but it's that separation at the beginning. It almost is a natural process when new parties try to create new governments. The second issue, and this is very, very serious, is that the frustrations, the lack of change, the instability leads what used to be civil society, the way I understand it, the way I think you would understand it as well, it leads them to say, well, look, I've made my sacrifices, I've done the best I can, so what am I to do? I'm going to make sure that my family is taken care of. And so civil society becomes what you label very, very well, political society. It loses that connection, and it becomes part of the problem. And what the only solution for that, to the extent there is one, is to understand that that distinction is very important, as your assumption was absolutely right. And because I believe in civil society, I always throw it back to them, the people. What democracy represents, in another way of putting it, is the agency of citizens. So people, for whatever reasons, good or bad, apathy or fear, refuse to participate, then no one is held accountable. Who are you responsible to if no one's telling you what you want? It's not to criticize, these are just human dynamics that are very, very difficult to deal with. And part of the problem often is that people will participate if they think it matters. But if it's intransigence, if the government just listens and does nothing changes, then they're going to stop participating because they have better things to do, like work and put food on the table. So I was once in a meeting with executives from mining companies, and they said they have community consultations. And so I said, what does that mean to you? And what it meant to them is they went and they told the community what they were doing. And they were successful because people came to the meeting. So the first thing I said is, did you offer them food? Yes, well, maybe that's why they're coming. The second thing I said is that, did you change anything? Were there action items? No, we just reported what we did. And so I said, would they come if you didn't give food? Because if you're not changing anything, then that means you're not listening. It means there's no level of respect. And I think it's a concrete example of a general problem. And for me, and I can say this as a researcher rather than somebody who's an activist, it's important to understand the problem so that we can look for the right kinds of solutions. And then the last thing I'll say about the international, and this is something that is very different because of the nature of the economy and the threats in the Middle East and in Latin America and even Africa. There are different kinds of ways to help civil society. And so in Latin America, and I think this is very important elsewhere, the human rights movement was foreign funded and not imposed, but it was an external actor. And what it was able to do is help protect people from the abuses of government and nurture civil society, at least in that component. So a lot of it depends on the motives of the external actor as well. And I think the same criteria again apply. Whether it's there to help people to make things better or not. You know, are the external actors following their funders' priorities, some strategic plan, or do they genuinely want to make the world a better place? And some organizations, unfortunately, aren't as good at it or as committed as others. We need to make those distinctions so that we can look for the kinds of external influences that we want to promote and the kinds that we want to condemn and try and minimize. But thank you for the comments. They're very, very helpful.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Professor Akson, for your interesting speech. My question basically is about the... I'm Mariam Dawood, I'm a teacher. So my question is going to be about the role of media in civil society, democracy, and the role of religion. Because today in the media we have a misrepresentation or a distortion of the picture of civil society, for instance. We have those, for example, media outlets who represent civil society as the enemy. You know, the conspiracy theory, civil society is funded by the West, and they're gonna, ruin or corrupt your country, and you are no more agents. So you don't have any role, you are puppets. So the West is doing everything. And on the other hand, also we have this godlike image also of civil society. It's the watchdog, they are transparent, they are above the government, they are above everything. So we should trust them like blindly. And also about the issue of religion. Because in the media also you have this conspiracy theory also about the foreign, elements who are from Saudi Arabia, if I may say. They are promoting their vision of Islam. They're going to Islamize the country. Women will not be able to go outside without the veil. This kind of stereotypes and this kind of fear that will basically damage the trust of people in each other. So the media, I think, basically has a pivotal role to play in this whole issue. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you for your question. It's very important.
Can you please there are 5 or 6 other questions?
Okay, yeah. So I'll say 2 things. This is a problem everywhere. And it's a problem because despite the information revolution and the internet, the control over the media is more and more concentrated. And the people that own the media are not necessarily sympathetic to civil society, particularly in outside of Western Europe and North America, but even there are problems. Or to democracy, particularly outside of North America and Western Europe. And what happens too, and this feeds it, is that crime and violence sells. So it becomes sensationalist. So it's a deliberate manipulation to show civil society in its worst aspects, because that sells more newspapers, it gets more readership, but it also creates a vicious circle. And so, when was the last, for example, in a government of national unity, to seek those basic compromises? But I think, this is something we often don't appreciate, is that sometimes it's the extremes that have the clearest alternative, so people latch onto them for lack of an alternative. In Latin America, it wasn't religion. In Latin America, it was a very extreme kind of economic liberalization that favored banks. And so what happened? It became the alternative because it was clearly defined. It seemed to be able to deal with pressing problems like inflation. But not long after, people began to realize it was extreme. Why? Because the economy would grow, but unemployment would stay very high or get worse. Inequality would get worse. And so the economy is doing really, really well, but unless you're a banker, you're not doing very, very well. So that's just an example of the extremism. So at crossroads, whether people opt for religion or something else like democracy, or for extreme economic policy as opposed to something like democracy, depends on what their options are, what they're given. The media plays an important role in that. But we need to think ourselves, or political leaders need to think through, what are the alternatives that one could use as a counterpoint to extremism in any form. And here, I think much of the responsibility lies with universities. I mean, we don't come up with the alternatives that we used to. The social sciences, in many senses, and I'm one of them, so this is a self-criticism, isn't as innovative as it was. So think about it. When we had the first wave of democratic transitions, to quote a famous social scientist named Samuel Huntington, all sorts of ideas were in debate. We had psychology, Freud versus Jung. We had Keynes versus others. We had an effervescence of the public sphere, alternatives for people to latch onto, including horrible ones like fascism. We have nothing like that now, and that's good. Fascism doesn't have the same currency, but it means people's choices are limited. And oftentimes, at the crossroads, high levels of frustration, people latch onto at least what seems to be clear and promise something that's different, even if in the end it won't deliver. So it's not a very good answer to that question, but it's an important one. And what I always emphasize is that that crossroads has been met successfully historically in a number of countries. And a lot of it depends upon leaders being able to provide alternatives that are more mainstream and more respectful of basic human rights. And civil society to latch onto those, to look for those, to promote those. And for universities and the thinkers of our day to come up with alternatives that can allow or provide political leaders of civil society something to work with. Because remember too, all religious groups have a large amount of writing behind them. They selectively choose what they want to emphasize. And it's not only Islam. Catholicism is interpreted in a variety of ways. Christianity even more so. So I think there's a real lack, a real need for academics like myself to start thinking about alternative ways of understanding the world so that when we're at that crossroads, there will be a more appropriate response that people can understand because it's respectful of basic fundamental human rights. Thank you.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. عادل العلي رئيس حزب تونس الزيتونة. حبيت نقوله هو يجب أن نبين الخصوصية للبلدان والشعوب المسلمة والعداء المتعصب من غير المسلمين من القوى العظمى وهم يتحكمون في أذنابهم في بلداننا. لذلك نجدهم يرفضون حتى النجاح والنهوض عندما يتم من طرف قوى إسلامية بل يعملون على إفشالهم بكل الطرق وهذا عشناه أو يقومون أو يشجعون انقلابات عسكرية وعندنا مثال حي قريب تركيا ويصبح في الإعلام العالمي الانقلاب والحكم العسكري الدموي قمة الديمقراطية بتسويق نفاق مرير ومقيت. ونقول حاجة أخرى حتى على مستوى الاحتلال اليابان تقريبا احتلت وألمانيا تقريبا احتلت وهي دول عظمى ومتقدمة بينما العراق اللي هي فيها مقومات دولة عظمى تراها تفتت وتسلم لقمة سائرة بعد الاحتلال الأمريكي إلى دولة دهمائية ما عندها حتى علاقة حتى بالعقل. النتيجة واحدة عندما يتعلق بالشعوب والقوى الإسلامية تجد هناك قوى فعلا عندها عداء متعصب لكل ما هو مسلم ولا ترضى له النجاح حتى ولو تبنى الديمقراطية وربما الانفتاح السلم العالمي. كمان.
Yeah, no.
Don't mind. Let's take the rest of the
Yeah, okay, yeah.
Because we have to wrap up in
Good point, yeah.
5 minutes.
Oh, okay.
كل واحد دقيقة توا باش نحاول نختم. لا سامحني.
السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. سلام فرجاني. بالرغم من تحصل الرباعي راعي للحوار معناها للرباعي على جائزة نوبل وتحقيقنا لإنشاء حكومة وحدة وطنية، ألا تعتقد أنه في غياب مشروع وطني مبني على عدة ضوابط ولا مثل الشفافية المالية ومثل العمل على إعادة بناء المنظومة البنكية وعديد المواضيع والجباية وغيره من ذلك، أنه هذا هو السبب الأساسي لعدم نجاح المجتمع المدني في تحقيق أهدافه، وأن هذا أيضا أعطى لا أعتقد أن هناك عداوة من حكومات أو من دول معينة للإسلام السياسي على قدر ما هو هناك عدم وجود لبرنامج واضح يعطي رؤية واضحة لصانع القرار في البلدان الصديقة لإعانة الدولة التونسية والشعب التونسي على تجاوز مرحلة الانتقال الديمقراطي. بارك الله فيك.
شكرا أستاذ العزيز هذه البسطة الضافية والمقارنة بين التجربة الأمريكية اللاتينية والتجربة في تونس. ونحن نعلم أن زعيم لاهوت التحرر أوسكار روميرو إذا كان له ميزة فهي ادخال الكنيسة لصالح الشعب. كنيسة لصالح الشعب لصالح الفقراء، يعني لحمايتهم ضد نظام أنظمة عسكرية متغولة، ومضى شهيدا في مسيرته هذه. أنطونيو جرامشي أحد مفكرين الماركسيين اليساريين الماركسيين يتحدث عن المجتمع المدني باعتباره مجتمعا يواجه الفاشية وعسكرة المجتمع، ودعا الكنيسة أن تكون في حلف معه ضمن المجتمع المدني ضد العسكر وضد الفاشية. ما حصل مأزق، عندنا مأزق في تونس يختلف عن هذه المسألة، عندنا مأزق حقيقي. يعني ما حصل في تونس أن النظام البوليسي النظام الأمني الذي أقامه الرئيس السابق بن علي كان نظاما يقابل بين المجتمع المدني والمجتمع الديني، وبالتالي قام بتعبئة قوية يعني للمجتمع المدني ما شكله وسماه المجتمع المدني ضد ما سماه المجتمع الديني. هذه المقابلة متواصلة معنا إلى الآن، وهي منحه من خلالها موقف النقابة حينما كانت في الرباعي الذي أشرف على حوار كان لها دور سياسي، والآن في المستوى الاجتماعي الاقتصادي ليس لها دور سياسي. فالمشكلة هنا هي في استراتيجية تحديث المجتمع، تطوير هذا المجتمع. هل تنطلق من يعني تثمين ورسملة الثقافة المشتركة للمواطنين للمجتمع نحو غرس القيم المدنية الديمقراطية وبناء مجتمع مدني، اقتناع الشعب واندماجه بشكل عضوي في العملية الوعي الديمقراطي وممارسة الديمقراطية وحقوق الإنسان يعني المجتمع المدني والحرية والليبرالية إلى ذلك. هذه لا تعني شيء إذا لم يخرج فيها عموم الشعب، كل الشعب يخرج فيها. كيف يخرج هذا الشعب؟ يخرج الشعب من خلال ثقافته، من خلال مشتركه الثقافي، مشتركه الديني، مشتركه القيمي غير ذلك. يعني أن نحارب هذا المشترك ونقول ادخل المجتمع المدني، نحن وضعناه في مأزق بهذه الطريقة، وكأننا نريد أن نبني مجتمعا مدنيا للنخب وليس للشعب حتى يفعل فعلا في تطوير هذا المجتمع والوصول إلى غايات حقيقية، تحديث المجتمع، تطويره ودخول مساحات جديدة من التقاليد الديمقراطية وتقاليد حقوق الإنسان والحرية إلى غير ذلك. شكرا.
محمد سهيل مكي، مهندس ناشط بالمجتمع المدني. مرحبا بك يا أستاذ فيليب. وأنا باش نحب نحكي على عزوف الشباب. كان ثم إمكانية أستاذ تعطينا فكرة على الشباب في أمريكا اللاتينية وثوراتها، لأنه في تونس حسب ما قاعدين نلاحظوا، سيفتي أنا أيضا ناشط في المجتمع المدني، نأكد لك اللي أقل من 5% من نسبة الشباب الموجودين. هذا اختر على المستقبل، إلا فقط في الأحزاب، والأحزاب القديمة كانت طبعا حزبنا القديم حزب تونس الوحيد هو كان الشباب طامع لما طامع يشارك فقط لما طامع. والآن الحزب الوحيد اللي عنده شباب لأنه مقتنع إيديولوجيا، وهذا أنا اللي نشوفه المشكل الكبير في عزوف الشباب. هل ممكن تفيدنا بحلول؟ وبارك الله فيك.
Thank you very much for your lecture. Awishi Bashir, research in Bashir Awishi, researcher in British and American history. So, British and American history. So, if we can take this discussion back to the intellectual level, I think we haven't yet. We don't have the conditions or the preconditions to establish a free civil society the way you have in the West. Because you said that a minimum societal consensus is needed. In Tunisia, we do not have yet that consensus, because we have two separate groups dreaming about two different societies. A group which claims to be modernist and excludes all the other groups, and another group which is a bit conservative, but which is moving a bit slowly towards modernization and so on. So the condition that we have a free civil society in Tunisia is dependent on a real compromise between the two groups. And thank you very much.
Take two more.
Okay, that's okay.
There are a lot of questions.
I think that's a good sign, huh?
Yes.
أحسن. كل سهام حبيت أسأل في سياق الحديث تاعنا ثم قلنا إن هو مجتمع مدني متأدج، هذا متفقين عليه. المجتمع التونسي متأدج متفقين عليها. لاحظ أهم حاجة تلاحظ إنها فما كيلو حشمة، نوع من الحشمة من يعني المجتمع المدني اللي ياخذ السلك اللي هو حداثي متطور، عنده الإعلام، عنده الإمكانيات المادية، ما نلقاوش في فما توازن ما بين الشق اللي سوا ديزون محافظ، وهذا أنا ما نلومش فيه خاطر أي موقف ما يتعطلكش. الشق المحافظ هذا مش عارف باش يفرض رؤيته، ما سعاش باش يفك موقفه. حتى توا تلقى في المجتمع المدني ناس من الشق المحافظ الاعلام ما يوريهمش، يحشموا حتى باش يعطيه وجهه النظر نتاعهم. علاش؟ خاطر خوف انهم يحطوهم تحت اتيكيت الرجعيه، تحت اتيكيت انت تابع شق معين. علاش يعني الخوف هذا لازم يسمحها في الحاجه الباغاج اون لو فون باش نجموا نقدموا الوقت، وقتها يولي فما توازن ما بين الاتجاهات، وما نجموش نحيو التأدج من المجتمع بيسكو يظل عادة تونسية فيها.
السؤال الأخير
مين الرياحي ناشط في المجتمع المدني منذ 2011. أعتقد أن الكثير تدخل وتكلم على أنه المجتمع المدني متداخل كثير مع المجتمع السياسي. أقول أنه أكثر من 50% من الجمعيات في تونس غير معنية بالسياسة بتاتا. هنالك جمعيات تكوين تكون الشباب للمستقبل، وهذه الجمعيات ليست لها حضور يعني سياسيا، لأن هذه الجمعيات تشتغل وحدها. لذلك يعني هذه الجمعيات ناجحة، وهذه الجمعيات تكونت أكثر في تونس من 300 أو 400 ألف شاب في الخمس سنوات الأخيرة، وهذا الشباب تكون على التعايش السلمي في فترة الانتقال الديمقراطي. وهنالك الكثير من الجمعيات غير معروفة في النشاط السياسي يعني للنخبة السياسية، وهذه الجمعيات تشتغل وحدها كما قلت. وهنالك الآن تأسيس لجامعة جديدة في تونس، وهي الجامعة التونسية للرياضات الإلكترونية، وهذه الجامعة يتمحور حول أكثر من 300 ألف شاب ناشط في الرياضات الإلكترونية. ولذلك أقول أن الشباب قاطعة يعني النخبة السياسية وهو ينشط في المجتمع المدني وبعيد عن السياسة، وهذا الشباب له طموحات يعني في تونس، وسيكون له نفوذ في تونس أكثر من النفوذ السياسي. وشكرا.
Yeah. So what I think I'll try and do is address all of the different questions which were really very good and very thought-provoking, but not individually, but in just saying a few words. And so the first thing I want to do is refer back to the gentleman who mentioned Oscar Romero and Gramsci. And the reason I'm doing that is the following. One of the reasons why Oscar Romero, who was assassinated, a priest in El Salvador who was a victim of the Civil War, one of the reasons why he became such a powerful figure is that no one thought he would. So he came from a privileged background, he was a very conservative cleric, and then when he assumed the position that he came to assume in San Salvador, the capital, and confronted the poverty and the abuses that his people were suffering, he changed. And so the fact that he transformed himself from that part of this establishment, part of the problem, into one of its leading critics, was ultimately why he was killed by the same establishment, because he was the real threat. And I'm saying that is because we always have to keep in mind the importance of understanding the alternatives and the capacity that all of us as humans have to learn and to change and to transform ourselves. I mentioned Gramsci because oftentimes my approach to civil society is considered very Gramscian, because what I see coming out of civil society are the alternatives to the regimes that people are required to live under. So it's that public sphere, those debates that may be constrained by the media that ultimately are responsible for outlining the alternatives that may or may not exist. And Gramsci was famous for that because he talked about the role that grassroots intellectuals, common people who thought about it, could play in contributing to a change in perspectives and a change in the way societies are organized that would be more inclusive and more democratic. Although it wasn't necessarily the same kind of democracy we're talking about now, because he obviously was a communist, a very tolerant communist compared to others of the period. But the idea here is the role that people at the grassroots can play in changing their own society, which is what civil society is all about. The second thing I want to emphasize is that, as the second question pointed out, there are a lot of priorities. And I think what is important is that, and this is the value of democracy in a very fundamental way, is that the people themselves need to make those choices. Because when you have so many challenges, and this is true pretty much of every society in the world right now, there's no right or wrong place to start. It's a value judgment. And the only legitimate way, I think, to decide what should be the first priority is to consult with people. And civil society and its relationship to political society is key to that. And when the two aren't speaking, when civil society is weak or becomes part of the political culture, political society, then those alternatives don't evolve. The legitimacy of the process becomes questionable. And then we have real problems because it opens the doors for all kinds of alternatives that are not democratic, whatever they might be. And young people get caught in the middle of that. Why? Because if they can't realize their aspirations, however legitimate and realistic they should be, when they're young, then all hope is lost. And one of the challenges always is to convince young people that they're being listened to, that they're being taken into account, so that there's a reason to participate. It's not unique to Tunisia, it's not unique to Latin America, it's true everywhere. And to refer quickly back to the US elections, one of the reasons why Obama won in 2008, and one of the reasons why Bernie Sanders did so well in the Democratic primaries, is that he appealed to young people. He captured their imagination, and for however brief a period, participation became meaningful. And the result was that their candidates won. Then other problems entered in and youth withdrew again. And the challenge everywhere is to get youth involved and keep them involved. Because it's almost too simplistic to say this, but all of our futures depends on the futures of our children. And the dream of most parents is that their children will live as good, if not a better life as themselves. And when that promise becomes very difficult to achieve, then we're in real trouble. So we can't ignore the problem, we need to look for ways to engage with it. And so it's interesting, I know Facebook is really, really important in Tunisia. It was part of the revolution. I know, and I have to admit that I'm not good at it. I don't have a Facebook page. I know, I'm too old. But the reason though is that what we discovered is that when we advertised on Facebook, I knew this before I came to Tunisia, it was only reconfirmed, then the people, our students, they would come because they would hear about it. It would be interesting to them. So that means that leaders, however old they may be or not be, we also need to adapt how we relate to young people in ways that they can understand and appreciate. Because there's no way around it. If we don't address these issues, it will come back to haunt us. And we look at the West and the policies of the West towards Islam, I think the first place that countries need to look at is how they treat Muslims in their own society. And it's that same youth frustration that breeds extremism in the slums of Paris, the slums in the United States, the slums in Canada. It's that frustration, it's that exclusion that drives young people out of desperation to look for alternatives that at least offer the promise of being better. And I think the problem too is that because countries don't look at themselves before they start judging other countries, which is not very smart, because of that, they then misunderstand the rest of the world. So they see the threat of Islam through the eyes of their own marginalized young Muslim men in particular, but not only men now, more and more women. And then they label everybody as being the same, not understanding why it became a problem in the first place, which is really a weakness of civil society and democratic inclusion in their own countries. So then we have scapegoating, blaming external actors for their own problems, projecting that outward, and of course complicated by the fact that, for better or for worse, oil is in the Middle East, and that clouds everything because it makes people speak strategically and narrow-mindedly. And whatever one might think of the oil economy, it's hard to say it's a humane economy that respects basic human rights and the rights and values of people. And finally, in terms of overcoming the polarization within Tunisian society, I think what's important is to always remember that what are the alternatives? Societies can't live together when they're polarized. And the more polarization that takes place and the more ingrained and deep that polarization is, in the end everybody loses. Because you can't have democracy, you can't have civil society, and in the extreme, it becomes violent civil war. And so there's an obligation to at least try and look for alternatives, because if we don't look for alternatives to polarization, the opportunists, the political class in the worst sense, whether or not they do so in religious guise, will take advantage of the opportunities for their own personal benefits. So to take the worst example possible, it has nothing to do with Islam, it's genocide. Recent cases, Rwanda and Bosnia. Those were opportunistic elites who were able to mobilize frustrated, excluded people, particularly young people, to engage in the worst atrocities. And they were able to do so because they were able to take advantage of these long, simmering social problems. We can put our heads in the sand and ignore them, but only at our own peril. Because they come back in the least expected ways. And so to conclude, I sincerely think that the ideals that the quartet at its best represented are the kinds of ideals of a strong civil society that are fundamental to finding ways around polarization, finding ways to respect human rights in a basic way that allows citizens to set their own priorities and determine what is and what isn't important. Very idealistic, but there's more positive examples of that than we often recognize. And unfortunately, if we don't go for those positive examples, trying to make them come true, then the consequences will not be beneficial to anybody, including the short-term opportunists who think that they're going to benefit, but in the end it's all going to come crashing down on them as well. So I think I'll leave it at that. Thank you so much for these wonderful questions. I often would rather listen to you ask me questions and talk and then try and answer the questions because it provokes me, and that's how I learn. So thank you very much for your questions and for listening to me.
Thank you, Professor Philip Oxford, for a very, very lively discussion and very interesting lecture. I'm sure we benefited a lot from your experience. We thank you, and we look forward to continuing the relationship and visits to Tunisia. والآن أدعوكم إلى استراحة قهوة وشاي ونشكركم على الحضور.